Well, good afternoon, good morning. Some level of time between the last time we were able to be together and now. It's good to sit down with Terry and talk about the work that an evangelist, a preacher does. We've got a little bit of a schedule change. What we have done is move Bobby Blackburn's slot that we had scheduled for February into the first Tuesday in March, and it'll be a little later time. We'll put a note about that out for the specific details tomorrow. But today, Terry and I are going to talk about what to listen for in a sermon, um, realizing that it's an interesting shift to the other side of the coin, but it's actually something that Terry and I do a lot. I listen to a variety of sermons outside of the assembly. I do so with some very specific goals in mind when it's not corporate or together worship. I also make it a point to regularly now go and visit congregations as much as I can to hear other evangelists speak and teach. I think it's good for me spiritually. I think it's good for me as a disciple of Christ to make sure I'm being fed as well. But let's break some things down. Before we do that, though, Terry, how are you doing? You doing all right?
Doing great, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. All things considered, the challenges of life and the difficulties that sometimes exist, the Lord has been gracious to me, and I'm excited to be able to do the things that we do. So let's get to the heart of it. What are we talking about from your side of the table?
Well, we're talking about listening to sermons. Let me say, I think one of the things that is really good about that for preachers especially is it really is a good way for us to sharpen our axe and to, when you listen to somebody else or whether it's in person, on video, or audio, there's a lot to learn there and to consider, and you can improve your approach by seeing what is effective in others. That's often the best way for us to learn. So there's some real value in this. We don't want to pigeonhole, though, this idea. I think a lot of things we're talking about applies to everybody, not just preachers, on how to listen to sermons. So kind of want to throw that out there at the beginning and let everybody know that all are invited to listen.
Yeah, so let's get a couple of other things. We've got three areas like we always try to do to make things flow and be, on task. Um, but when we're talking about this, there are kind of two parts to the same.
Your audio just went away. And well, apparently I'm here by myself, and we'll see how that works out. Phil has gone bye-bye, just checking into that. So as we begin with this idea of listening in order to understand, we'd like to talk about that, and we'll see if Phil can hop back in here in a moment. So one of the things about listening to sermon for anybody, but especially for preachers, is that you listen to gain a greater sense of understanding. One of the things I think that is interesting in that regards is through listening to other guys, there's been times that they have shared things that maybe I've never thought about, or maybe it's a way to understand something not necessarily differently, but more effectively and more clearly, to have a clearer understanding. One of the requirements of that, by the way, I think, and I can see Phil's back. Phil, are you back with us?
I'm back.
Okay. One of the requirements of listening to understand has to be listening with somewhat of an open mind. If I go into a sermon listening on any subject with having my determination already made up about whatever it is that the subject topic is going to be, it's going to be hard for me to gain new understanding from that topic. So understand that the first kind of requirement is somewhat to have an objective nature to your listening before you can really grasp. By the way, especially for the preacher, and then I'll pull you back in, Phil. I think that's one of our frustrations sometimes is we may deliver a sermon and somebody doesn't really listen to what we say because they already have decided what they believe or understand on that particular passage or subject. And so if that frustrates us, then that's something that we need to avoid in our listening. By the way, part of that is just listening. Maybe we should have added a fourth point here of what it really truly means to listen. But so listening with an open mind and wanting to listen to understand something else and to gain new knowledge. And that's something that I think is really important, Phil. And you were lost pretty early on in your monologue. So if you want to pick back up.
Monologue. Well, yeah, I think, Blue Jeans decided to take a vacation, so it came back. One of the things I think is important, I don't know.
End, by the way.
Yeah.
It works fine on my end.
Yeah, that's a rarity. It's a very rare thing. Preachers sometimes struggle with this, and I'll go ahead and open up with this layer. We go listen to a sermon. We're in the assembly. We're listening to it, recorded, and we struggle with two splits of of most preachers. Either we listen to it and say, I could never approach that subject with that level of ability or clarity because I'm not capable, competent, good enough, smart enough, wise enough, old enough, mature enough, young enough, or whatever. And so we kind of emotionally bog down into the ineffectualness of our current setting, like where we are right now. Then we also have the other end of the table that is equally present in the preacher's life, where we listen to someone else preaching and we go, what is that guy doing? Doesn't he know what he's up to? He should just sit down and let somebody else do it. And this is throughout the entire arc of a preacher's life. That doesn't go away. It manifests itself in different ways across the journey of a preacher's experience. All of them are founded in insecurity or overabundance of confidence. That's an outgrowth of insecurity. But they're defective in the big goals. Like they actually hinder us from becoming what God needs us to be. And the moment that we tell ourselves to stop listening to a sermon, especially when we're in worship, like we're trying to dissect it on the autopsy table, we return to being the disciple we need to be. And so I think it's one of the things that Terry and I were talking about that we wanted to see take place was that discussion of how do we accomplish that goal of becoming a more impactful listener on our individual level when we're listening to that sermon, we're listening to that message that very first time. For me, there are some important tools that I use to do that. But I also listen to sermons outside of the assembly in a different way too, where I really am listening as a hopeful technician. So let's start with the in-assembly side, and we'll get to the other side in a second. So Terry, what are some of the things that you do when you're in worship to turn off the I'm the preacher switch and turn on the I'm the disciple switch, which by the way, probably shouldn't be such a big difference between the two.
Yeah. So I think one of the things to understand is, by the way, I found in the area of those two sides of I could never do this or what's this guy doing, I have always found something valuable in almost every sermon. I'm sure there may be one or two that's not the case. Almost every sermon I've ever listened to. And that would apply even on those times where admittedly I listen to a sermon and go, that wasn't the best sermon ever. There's still something to learn there. So I take that understanding, that foundational understanding into this event of listening to a sermon, which puts us, the challenge for preachers is it puts us on the other side of the table. That's very difficult for us. One of the things that I do that really helps me is when I listen to a sermon, I am very active using my Bible to stay involved where he's going, what he's, even if it's a passage that I know already, I'm still going to turn to that passage. I'm going to look at that passage. As much as that seems like such a trivial thing, I have found that for me, first off, that really helps me focus in on more on what matters than maybe when I'm on the other side. Because let me say this: I've been the training preacher in an internship, and I have been in places in that role where my job is to listen for a different purpose, to listen for the effectiveness of the delivery and those kind of things. So that's a little bit different for me. And when I do that, I'm listening on quite a different level than what we're talking about today. So following along in the scripture intently, and when I'm doing that, by the way, I really fight that temptation of either A, trying to guess where he's going next, or B, think about how he should have gone there next instead of where he went, which is part of the issue here that feeds that confidence beast monster inside of all of us. So try to, like I said earlier, we were waiting for you to come back on, try to be very objective, kind of empty your thoughts about how this sermon should be, how it should come across. Just pull out your Bible, try to listen with as fresh of a heart as possible in that whole process. And leave the critiquing behind. Don't do any of that. That's the other side as well.
Yeah, for me, I try to, one, make sure I am present in the text where he's present. So
Right.
if he's somewhere in the text, I join him. I don't try to be edges. If he's got an outline he's shared with us, whether it's on the screen above or it's something I can have in my hands, then I want to have that in my hands because he's put a lot of effort into trying to guide our hearts. And so I want to make sure I am attentive to that. For me, depending on whether it's a class or a sermon, will change the kind of notes I'm taking. I use digital technology on a regular basis to take notes, but I take them two different ways, either in Logos or in the note app. And so it will kind of change how I'm doing, even though I'll have my physical Bible with me open quite a bit. I'm still using those various means to track and maintain what he's trying to convey, because I might want to profit from it later personally, as a preacher, as a teacher, as a disciple. So I have to take notes. I can't remember everything. I struggle to remember enough as it is. So note taking is really personally important to me. In addition to that, I really try to invest myself in the reason that I'm there. Like I'm there to worship and praise Jehovah. That is the overarching goal of whenever I am assembled with my brethren, whether it's to sing, to observe the supper of the Lord, to worship by the preacher edge, the disciple edge of the table. I'm there to give glory and honor to God. And so I really try to do that, knowing that there's a lots of stuff going around me. I got kids. Sometimes they're doing kid stuff. I got family members. Sometimes they're doing family member things that are right with me in the assembly, like they're not feeling well or they've had a rough time, or all those things are part of the care package that I've got going on. So I try to really kind of make sure that I'm purposed.
Yeah. And if I'm at my home congregation, I've also got all that stuff on top of that too, right? Because you have, our work, there's a good portion of our work that is not just preaching. So all that stuff is another layer on top of the family, on top of everything else. There's a lot of distractions that are there if you're not careful. I was going to say, one of the things I try to do, I'm going to use this example. I don't know if it's good or not. When I fly somewhere, I'm not a pilot, so I just ultimately trust the pilot. I don't, if we hit turbulence, I don't go up and try to explain to the pilot how he should have fixed the turbulence and that kind of stuff. I try to approach a sermon the same way, even though it would be like me being a pilot on a plane piloted by somebody else. In that moment, I've got to let him direct that and control the direction, the trip, the journey. And that's kind of how I view a sermon a lot of times, is we're on a journey together. And in that journey, during that lesson, whoever is speaking is the tour guide. And I need to let him be the tour guide and just follow along. And that's kind of my approach to that, and I'm not a big note taker, but because I don't do it in Logos like you do, but one of the things I do is, I am a digital note taker when I have an idea. And what happens a lot of time during sermons is there'll be something that sticks out, and I will type that out in my note app or write it down in my Notability app with my pencil on my iPad or whatever it may be, and know that that's there. So that's another layer that I didn't include earlier. But, to me, the number one thing, as you said, is just staying in the text where he's at and letting him direct our thoughts to that. And Hal kind of brings up something that go ahead and introduce now, which is pretty entertaining, which he said, I'm trying to break the habit of putting my spin on the topic text addressed by another preacher. And I don't mean hammering the point home during announcements after the sermon. I mean shaking his hand in the foyer, giving him a 30-second version of the sermon I would have preached. I think it comes across as dismissive when people do it to me, like they were the pews preaching to themselves instead of listening to me, so I try not to do it to others. Yeah. So, and that was kind of what I was talking about earlier, that I think we need to avoid this idea of, oh, well, this is what I would have done. And so I don't know about you, Phil, but he mentions the comment thing. Whenever I'm somewhere and somebody comes up and tells me what I should have done with a sermon or how they would have done it, it is somewhat frustrating and dismissive. Sometimes there's some golden nuggets there, and that's great. But the comments that mean more to me after a sermon is when somebody comes up and points out something that they really appreciated, maybe they hadn't thought of before, maybe they needed to be reminded of, maybe they just liked the way it was said. Those comments show investment into the process rather than kind of this dismissive approach. And by the way, I don't know about you, Phil, but in my experience, preachers are the worst at what House is talking about. We are the worst at that. If we're not careful, we're all sitting there saying, oh, it'd have been better if you used this passage. Or every time that happens, it's always a preacher for me, always.
One of the things I think is, and we're the worst critics. Like, we will tear apart a sermon like it was fish meant to be off the bone. Like, we'll just take every ounce of it and fillet it. If something impacts me that the preacher has brought out, where that text, where God's word is being laid out to us in a way that's going to help me transform to be more like Christ, I make it a point for me to make a note of that, so that if I get the chance to talk to them afterwards, I want to thank them for bringing that to me, because they brought that meal to me. And I try really hard, especially now at this point in where I am, to make that a part of the encouragement that we're sharing together, because maybe that's what they planned to do. Maybe they didn't plan that part of the sermon to have that impact, but if it impacts me, then I want to specify it and identify it to the guy who just preached the lesson. Say, look, that was excellent. I really appreciated that. I needed to hear it. Not we, I. Because I think the royal we and the corporate we get a little overused, and it's a good way to also do one more thing, which is to take the lesson from academic information and make it be more of, this is what we as believers need to actually be doing. And I think that's another edge. We've got that planned. It doesn't really happen very much in the process of things. That we only sit there and we're like, I want to understand all these incredible details of the text, and we don't make the shift to, now what do I do with it? I know more now. And then, well, now what?
Yeah, so that's kind of our second point, right? Is listening in order to do. You kind of transition there. Well, yeah, one of the things to think about in that is the same. You got to first come in with the same idea as the understanding is, and I think sometimes we could be guilty of this too. I mean, I have lots of area for improvement, right? And I hope that in whatever lesson or book I'm reading or podcast I'm listening to, that I'll find something that makes me a better person after that moment than before. What is it I can find in there that's going to help me act better, that's going to help me to be a better husband, a better evangelist? What is it that I can put into action that is practical, that I can apply to my life, that helps me be a better disciple in every area of my life? So, and again, by the way, I think one of the things about this is, you and I were talking kind of pre-show. It isn't that hard. These are the things we want people to do with our sermons. We should do that with everyone else's.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so, yeah,
especially this, I'll add this tidbit. As I've matured as a preacher, as I've matured as a disciple, I can tell you that the way that I listened to sermons as a young man and a young disciple versus how I listen to sermons now are two very different things.
amen. Absolutely. Yeah.
Uh, we could have retitled this little thing, "I'm sorry to all the sermons I've heard before." Uh, you know,
Yeah.
especially as young Christians, because sometimes legitimately we were not, at least I'll say for me, I was not focused on the right things. Um,
No. Yeah, you
where,
and I met when I was like 19 years old, and I can tell you 19-year-old Terry Francis did not listen to sermons the same way 45-year-old Terry Francis
yeah,
does.
uh,
And I will also say, and I told you this pre-show, when I made the decision to start preaching full time and make that my focus, that actually changed the way I listen to sermons a whole lot. And I think I was more focused and more tuned in than I had been previously, because there is things you can learn to help you do your job better. And so that changed my even intent at that point. But as you mature, these things certainly become easier. At least we hope. Maybe it's a
right.
better way to say that.
So, when you're listening and get some understanding, you want to make kind of like you're listening to like, what do I need to change, mature, continue in the application side? But another thing that comes up is that I'm also listening in order to share this with somebody else. One of the things that's consistent in the scriptures, you see that in the application side of the New Testament, is people understood in order to share it to others. And so that shifted the way I listen to the sermon too. Like I'm listening in order to go talk about it to somebody else, to go share the idea with somebody else. And I want to be able to actually have a healthy what's next kind of look at things that goes beyond me doing the thing to me sharing it with someone else. And I'm only going to accomplish that if I've actually listened to the lesson itself, and made it personalized. Like now it's my lesson, now it's my subject matter, and then did the next step, because there'll be somebody who I need to share this with in the future.
And by the way, I think that listening to teach sometimes can have two phases to it. I think part of that can be from the more intellectual understanding level, and some of that can be also from even maybe a mechanical level. There's been sermons where guys explained something that I already knew and understood, but the way they explained it was so much more effective in the explanation area that improved my ability to teach that tremendously.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing to keep in mind is sometimes what you learn may be just a more effective way to say something that you've already said before, just wasn't very effective.
Right.
And so when we think about how listening to sermons helps us to teach, that's one of those areas I think that is maybe what I find even sometimes more beneficial is just hearing how guys with different backgrounds, different understandings, different personalities, all of that put things together in a different way. And there's been some real light bulb moments for me in not so much the understanding, but the ability to deliver it more effectively, which then makes
Which
me a better teacher.
which is purpose for us to flip the table a little bit, go back to our very first topic, and talk about listening to sermons outside of the assembly, a little bit,
Yeah.
which is a big part of your typical preacher's spiritual diet, because they're preaching, they're not listening to preaching. And so with the advent of any form of modern technology throughout our generations, whether it was cassette tapes, CDs, or now podcasts. I'm listening to sermons outside of the assembly. Like I'm no longer with my brethren in that sense, but I'm listening to the preaching that may have taken place or the teaching that may have taken place there. And sometimes I'm listening for different things. Um, and so sometimes I'll sit down and listen to a sermon because the sermon deals with a specific topic that I'm going to be teaching soon. And so I want to understand how this person sees the text. I listen to that sermon or class a lot differently at that point and a lot more methodically than I would in the assembly, because one of the things I do a lot if I'm listening to one of those compressed messages is I pause. I hit pause on the audio and I'll write some
down
stuff
things
out.
and stop. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Uh,
unless you're driving, don't write down things while you're driving.
no, you just tell your phone to take a note. Uh,
Yeah.
okay. Let's hope you're using those safe drive modes. Um, but really, I think that's something that's important that shifts the way you interact with a message. Because my do might change a little bit, like what I'm seeking to accomplish, rather than only personalizing it into my discipling side of life. Now I'm asking a different question. This guy's really good at teaching this thing. Like he's really, really good at whatever this is. And I'm not. Like that happens a lot. And so now how did he do that? Like what was his mechanic for explaining this? Did he use a visual aid? Did he tell a story that's a universal story, a parable from life, a parable from the text, a parable from experience? How can I relate this very complicated thing that he somehow has simplified myself? And so when I'm changing the mode, sometimes I'm listening to individuals who are experts in their field explain something. And so again, I'm going to take a different set of notes for that. Those notes look different than the notes I would have taken as a disciple in a class. Now I am trying to become an educator, an informer, a leader, a teacher. And so I'm noting different things. And so for me, those notes actually looks a lot different. If anyone's familiar with the way in which television shows, movies, and even comic books function, they're storyboarded. And so those notes for me are very much a storyboard of steps where I draw out a picture of how I want to teach the thing after I've learned how they taught the thing. I don't know if anyone else does that, but I draw out storyboards a lot with the full-on boxes and the pulpit and the charts and arrows and lines like a madman just about by hand. Like that's one of the few things I still do with a pen and paper. If there, I don't know, is that similar for you?
No, I am not a cartoonist, so I don't draw cartoons.
I didn't say they were
I,
good.
you know,
That's what I do.
I more just put things in kind of a bullet kind of outline of things. When I get to the development phase, that's probably where I do something. I do more of kind of a bubble chart, flow chart kind of thing than a storyboard. But we all have our different methods, right? That's
Terry's
really
not
my
going to be cracking up
brainstorming
and
process.
thinking me about the sermons in the future. He's like,
Well, I'm
now
just
he's
wondering
like,
what your hairstyle is behind the pulpit. Anyway, so, but no, I mean, mentally I may do something similar, but I don't actually draw it out. The point being that when I'm listening for something, kind of get us back on task, it does have this different approach. And I'm like you. When I'm got a particular maybe difficult topic coming up, I'm gonna search through maybe my Apple Podcast app, maybe through different preachers, maybe just even a Google search to find different sermons, maybe different written articles. But I'm gonna search through all of that, and I'm gonna find the stuff to kind of research, and I approach it the same way I would a book or a commentary. So I listen, I stop, I digest, I listen. I may go back and re-listen. If I find something really good, I might re-listen to a section or a whole sermon 2 or 3 times just to make sure I didn't miss any of that. And take those um, ideas and then try to put them into application. So it is completely different in how you approach those two things.
Right. And it's not that much different though. Yes, I use storyboards, but you can do it with bullet marks. You can do it with an outline. You can do it however you want to mechanically go about it. It's the same way you profit from a book you're reading. You're reading the book, they're explaining information, you take notes, you might mark certain pages at certain points to the method that they use to kind of open up a topic or open up an idea. And all of those things come back to packaging of the next time I preach, the next time I speak. And so I've now listened to the message in a different context because my goal is to learn so that when I lead hearts to glorify God, I am more effective in that process. I think a lot of times, if you remove the emotions, both positive and negative, about how preachers kind of get off track in the assembly when we're worshiping together, it's partially that. Like we instantly shift into how can I use this in my next sermon when we're forgetting that this is the sermon I need to listen to right now. Because there have been times where, and this is something I think is really valuable, I've been to worship somewhere, I've heard the sermon as a disciple in the assembly, and I tell myself, I'm glad this is recorded so I can go back to it next week because I really want to break down, and I'll make a note, minute 5 to minute 8, in the sermon. So I'll zoom right back to that spot, listen to those 3 or 4 minutes again, because however that section was, that's where I maybe was most impacted. And I want to take that most impactful statement and really analyze it to say, okay, now what? That's part of the craft rigor side of preaching, by the way, that you don't understand at all, at least for me, when you first started entering into the work. You're just excited to teach and share God's word rather than becoming a practitioner who is trying to excel.
And I think that's the part of the craft that the non-preacher never fully appreciates, to understand the amount of effort and hours that often go into this, to keep sharpening those skills. And I think one of the things to keep in mind in all this, if you're listening, and especially, regardless of how old you are as a preacher, but if you're a preacher, what all this really is saying too is that you should be doing these kind of things to continue to get better. That's and I think that's one of the important parts of this is, if you look at this originally and you realize that we're focusing mainly on how preachers should listen to sermons, you might think, well, why would I listen to that? I'm a preacher. I don't really listen to sermons. And if you're not, you need to probably readjust that approach, is what we're strongly suggesting to you.
And it's kind of tied together to this. Most congregations that Terry and I are aware of, because of the dynamics of the location, economics, personalities, all of that, they exist in a single guy context. They have their preacher. What happens in that context is that preacher might deliver the very best meals they can, but because of the schedule, the time, they're also starving half the time spiritually, unless they go out and go to a spiritual buffet that is not the one that they brought the meal to. And there are some dynamics to that are really significant, especially for younger guys, to understand early that you've got to get that food coming in somewhere else. Is to bring that for the preacher and have something else to really build them up. The best case scenario would be the biblical model of two men working together. That seems to be a great scriptural organization thing. You might note that from the standpoint there's about as much equal emphasis on elders, plural, as the example of preachers, plural. And Paul's low points are only found when he is not surrounded by at least one other worker, and he wouldn't even leave unless he brought someone with him. Okay, rant
Yeah, I was
off.
going to
Back
say
on the.
you said that two preacher. I was going to say two or more. And maybe that's a whole nother discussion, but you and I are both, we realize let me say it this way, we realize some of the financial challenges to that, but we both are very much pro multiple worker arrangement. And I guess we don't want to get too in depth to that, but I will say that that's one of my frustrations with so many churches is part of the reason we can't have some more multiple worker arrangements is because we have a lot of smaller sized churches who can't afford that arrangement. That's a whole nother broadcast, but that is the most effective. But if you find yourself, like most of us, not in that current situation, it's very hard to be fed when you're the one that is serving the meal. So you have to find spiritual food elsewhere. And that's one of the things we're trying to emphasize. I know we're almost out of time. Hal's got a couple more comments. He's going to roll today. I like his comment here about he listens more like a miner in locations other than where he works, trying to find nuggets to use, and more like a minister when a preacher visits the local work, seeing that as an extension of what he's been doing. And I think there's some great idea there. And then he said his biggest gripe with listeners is that they have no intention of growing in their faith. I owe it to them to grow in my faith and work, if only to avoid hypocrisy. And I think that's true, is that we have to make sure we're growing and being nurtured so that we don't become the very thing that frustrates us.
And all of this, and maybe we can kind of sum this up in some ways. One of the things that's really been valuable for me is to step back and not judge the interest of a listener based on the pain of the past. And so if I assume they're not going to grow, they won't, because I won't allow them to. But if I assume that they're there for Jehovah, his son, Elohim, then they have the potential to do so. The opportunity is there. And so I think that changes the way I see them in the audience. Even the rotten vegetables that he talks about, you know, the tares have to stay, you know, because God said let them there. And so there's some shift there. Well, there's a great question from Keith Maddox. What are some of the best methods to get spiritual food elsewhere if you are the only worker? Solid question. I'll tell you what I do. Terry can tell you what he does. Some of them are location specific. Okay, so for me, the church at Eastside has an assembly pattern where we do 3 hours in the first part of our Lord's Day. So from 9 to 12, we meet for 2 Bible classes and a worship period. That affords me some flexibility on some of the Sunday evenings. About twice a month, I have the opportunity, if I can work it out, to go visit elsewhere. And so there's a congregation nearby that my kids like to go visit some of the other kids there. And so we'll go there. I'll go to another nearby congregation on the other Sunday nights if I can. And so that's part of my first layer answer. Second thing is if I'm aware of quality podcasts, and I'll say in the broadest sense, not just other congregations where I might choose to worship, I will subscribe to them. I may not listen to every single episode because of time, but there's 10 or 12 podcasts that are spiritually focused that I listen to on a rotational basis when I get in the car, when I sit down at home. Not because I'm researching a topic, but because on a regular basis, these particular groups deliver consistently competent messages. I'm looking for competency in those things because I'm choosing to rather than quantity. So I want better if I can. And then I still read a ton.
Yeah, reading has to play into this for spiritual food. And the great thing about reading these days is, you know, be creative about that. You can do that digitally. You can listen to books on, you know, audiobooks through Audible. You could do a lot of things. Podcasting and like you, I listen to a lot of podcasts that aren't necessarily me put it this way, I wouldn't necessarily always doctrinally agree with them on every aspect, but I listen to their podcast because there's still some great value in that. And sometimes I learn quite a bit because it gets me out of the comfort zone of where I come from. And so, and you just find those on your own. But podcasting today, we live in a time, Phil, the greatest part about this is we live in a time where it is far easier to get our hands on those kinds of materials than it has ever been before, and cheaper. I mean, when you and I started preaching, if you wanted to get some kind of nourishment outside of just reading your Bible, you pretty much had to buy the book, or find a friend who could get the tape for you from somebody you wanted to listen to. I mean, when we started, this idea of podcasting was a foreign concept. That's how old we are. So you didn't have that opportunity. The idea of digital recording had not even begun. So, and some of the, some guys I just like listening to. And you can subscribe. You could subscribe through their website to their sermons. And that doesn't mean you listen to all of them, but you might have something come up and go, oh, I want to check that out, and you listen to that. So, but there's just you have so many opportunities to be spiritually fed today, easier than it used to be.
Yeah. So for me, I'll just give a quick rundown of the variety of podcasts as the last tidbit. So I listen to a couple of technical podcasts that are biblically related, like Naked Bible and the Bible Project podcast. Those are more in the technical range, talking about storytelling, talking about the dirty, gritty details of sections of the Old Testament. I listen to some devotional surface level podcasts where they're talking about generic topics or encouraging topics, like Excel Still More from the guy I won't mention. Okay, Chris Emerson, but I like to hassle him as much as we can. But Carrie Nywoff is another one, Tom Ranier's thing, Ranier on Leadership. A couple digital ones that are Bible cornered, like Pro Church Tools with Brady Shear and a few others. They're all kind of in that range. But I also listen to stuff like by Seth Godin, his Akimbo podcast, because I want to know about marketing. I listen to tech stuff because there's a surprising interaction between tech issues and spiritual issues. And a lot of smaller podcasts that are less known by brethren, like A Pew Potato by Josh Hudson. Some of the other ones that are, narrowed down. I listen to Brent Kercheval from time to time and his expository sermon series because he does a good job. His dad every once in a while. I listen to Terry sometimes. Usually when I want to learn how not to do something, I listen to Terry. So that's just like a short list of the podcast side. I listen to some video stuff. I'll watch some guys on video too. And like I said, a lot of books. That's probably the largest part of my diet outside of going. And if you're at a place where you can't change the schedule, like you can't flip the schedule around somehow, then find a way to get those Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday opportunities to go listen to a gospel meeting, to go to a preacher study, to go to a Bible class taught by somebody else. So at least that's my short list.
Yep.
I think Terry's might be the same on some of those, different on others. That's about it for today. We've got one other thing we want to again mention. Next Tuesday, I think we're going to be starting at about 12:30 Eastern, 11:30 Central with Bobby Blackburn. We're going to be having him come talking about the preacher and investing and planning for the future, and having some expertise there. We had to adjust the schedule a little bit to fit that in. So that's next Tuesday, 11:30 Central, 12:30 Eastern. And Bobby Blackburn will be here with us, and we'll make fun of Bobby quite a bit. If you want to see him just, emotionally subjected to the pain of the two of us, you can come for that. Terry, anything last things you want to mention before we close out?
Just real quick, as a preacher, think about this: is these things we talked about are the same way you want your people to listen to you. So make sure your sermons are easily understood, something that can easily be applied and something that can be retaught. If your
Yeah.
sermons don't meet that criteria, you need to rethink the way you present your material. And I just think that's kind of a nugget to take home as far as an application for all of us.
Yep. All right, everyone. Have a great day. If you need something, let us know. If you have questions, message us. We're happy to help. Take care.